Imagine an empire where 23 languages are spoken and everything works. A message leaves the western border at dawn. It passes through 111 relay stations, each one manned, each one stocked with fresh horses. 7 days later, it reaches the eastern frontier. 1,677 miles, covered faster than any system on Earth will manage again for the next 2,000 years. The people who built this did not force their subjects to pray to their gods. They did not burn foreign temples. They did not impose a single language on 100 nations. Instead, they asked one question that no empire before them had ever thought to ask. What if we let them keep everything and just run the system? This was Persia, the first civilization to turn tolerance into an operating system. And it worked so well that it took the most famous conqueror in history to burn it down. But even he could only burn the building. He could not burn the question. By the end of this story, we will understand how one empire invented the blueprint that every empire after it copied. We will see why a single night of fire could not erase it, and we will learn why the road still remembers what the palace forgot. Empires before Persia ruled by erasure, flattened the local gods, imposed the imperial language, replaced the memory. Persia was the first to realize that erasure is expensive and integration is scalable. That insight alone changed the trajectory of civilization. To understand what Persia built, we need to understand where it came from. The Persians called themselves Aryana, a name that survives today in the word Iran. They were not born in palaces. They were horsemen, pastoral nomads who practiced vertical migration, summers in highland valleys, winters in the lower foothills where the grass was thicker. They wore trousers, not robes, ideal for riding, alien to the people of Mesopotamia. They ate simply, they rarely drank, and they were, by every account, fierce. The word Pars in their own language meant warrior. These were not the people anyone expected to build the most sophisticated administrative system on Earth, but that is exactly what they did. It began with one man. In the mid-6th century BCE, a vassal prince named Kurosh led a rebellion against the Median Empire. The Greeks would later mangle his name into Cyrus. Several powerful Median clans, fed up with their own king, defected to his side. The Median army crumbled. On the site of the decisive victory, Cyrus founded a city, Pasargad. It would become the first capital of a new empire. Then he moved fast. Lydia fell, Ionia fell, Parthia, Armenia, Bactria, all absorbed in a campaign so rapid that the ancient world had no precedent for it. But the real test was Babylon. In 539 BCE, the Persian army approached the greatest city in the world. The Babylonian king, Nabonidus, had alienated his own priesthood by neglecting the chief god Marduk. When Cyrus arrived, the gates opened without a fight. No siege, no slaughter. The priests of Marduk welcomed him as a liberator. More than a military victory, it was a proof of concept. Cyrus had discovered that an empire could expand faster through negotiation than through destruction. But the man who invented this principle did not live to see its scale. In 530 BCE, Cyrus marched north to secure his borders against the Massagettai, a fierce steppe confederation led by Queen Tomiris. He did not return. The Persian army was shattered. Cyrus was killed on the field. The greatest empire builder of the ancient world died in a frontier skirmish against nomads who fought the way his own ancestors once had. Power passed first to his son Cambyses, who added Egypt to the empire, and then through a contested and possibly violent succession to a man named Darius. Darius was not a direct descendant of Cyrus. He legitimized his rule by claiming descent from Achaemenes, a semi-legendary ancestor. From that point on, the dynasty carried his name, the Achaemenids. And Darius had no interest in being remembered as a conqueror. He wanted to be remembered as an engineer. The year is roughly 500 BCE. Darius I sits on the throne. He did not inherit a small kingdom, he inherited a landmass stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, the largest empire the world had ever seen. Governing it should have been impossible. The Assyrians had tried brute force. It worked for 3 centuries, then it collapsed in 612 BCE. The Babylonians tried cultural domination. It held for 70 years, then it crumbled. Darius tried something no one had attempted at this scale. He built a system. The first pillar was decentralization. Darius divided his empire into roughly 20 satrapies, semi-autonomous provinces, each governed by a satrap who collected taxes, enforced law, and managed local affairs. The genius was not the division, it was the oversight. Every satrap answered to the imperial center, and every satrap was watched. The second pillar was the road. The royal road ran from Sardis near the Aegean coast to Susa in the Persian heartland, 1,677 miles of maintained highway with 111 relay stations, each stocked with fresh horses, provisions, and royal couriers. A message could cross the empire in 7 days. An army would take 90. Call it logistics if you want. It was control at the speed of information. The road did not merely connect cities, it connected the king's eyes to every corner of his domain. The third pillar was language. Not Persian, but Aramaic. Darius understood that forcing 100 nations to speak Persian would breed resentment, so he chose a neutral tool. Aramaic was already the lingua franca of trade across the Near East. By making it the official language of administration, Darius created a single bureaucratic layer that could run from Egypt to India without translation errors. The empire spoke a dozen tongues at home. On paper, it spoke one. The fourth pillar was the one that made the machine work: tolerance. Not as a philosophy, not as moral kindness, as infrastructure. The road remembers what the palace forgets, and the road was built on a single principle. A subject who keeps his gods, his customs, and his local authority is a subject who does not rebel, not idealism, engineering. But the system had more layers than 4 pillars. Darius standardized the currency across the entire empire. The gold daric, stamped with an image of the king kneeling with a bow, became the first coin accepted from the Aegean to the Indus. 1 gold daric equaled 20 silver sigloi. A soldier earned 1 daric per month. A sheep cost 3 sigloi. For the first time, a merchant in Sardis and a trader in Babylon were using the same money. Economic unity, not just political control. The empire operated not from 1 capital but 5. Pasargad, Cyrus's foundation. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart. Ecbatana, the old Median capital, used as a summer retreat. Susa, the administrative nerve center. And Babylon, kept as a fully functioning imperial capital because abandoning it would have been wasteful. 5 capitals for 5 functions. No other empire had thought in these terms. And at the system's military core stood the immortals. 10,000 professional soldiers, heavy infantry. The number never changed. When a man fell, killed, wounded, or retired, his replacement was already waiting. The enemy faced the same 10,000 every time. The name may be a Greek mistranslation of the Persian word for companions, but the psychological effect was real. An army that could not be diminished. Darius also ordered the construction of a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, the first version of what we now call the Suez Canal. It did not connect the seas directly, but it linked the Red Sea to a branch of the Nile Delta, enabling navigation between 2 oceans for the first time in history. He erected granite stelae along the canal in 4 languages. The inscription read, "I ordered this canal to be dug from the river called the Nile to the sea that goes to Persia, a canal between 2 seas." 24 centuries before Ferdinand de Lesseps broke ground on the modern Suez Canal, a Persian king had already understood the equation: whoever controls the waterway controls the trade. And just outside the palace walls, The Persians created something that gave the world a word we still use every day. Their royal gardens, irrigated, symmetrical, filled with flowers, fruit trees, and flowing water, were called in Old Persian paradisa, enclosed paradise. The word traveled through Greek and Latin and became the English word paradise. The Persian idea of heaven was not abstract, it was a garden. The religious architecture was just as deliberate. The Persians followed Mazda worship, an early form of Zoroastrianism centered on Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of truth and order. But this was not monotheism. Mitra, the god of light, Anahita, the goddess of fertility, Angra Mainyu, the spirit of darkness, all existed in the system. Scholars call it henotheism, many gods acknowledged, one elevated above the rest. The king was king of kings, and his god was god of gods. Here is the thing. This structure made tolerance not just possible but logical. If your own theology already accepted the existence of other divine beings, letting conquered peoples keep their gods was not a concession. It was consistent. And beneath all of it, beneath the roads, the satraps, the currency, the temples, the Persians built something most visitors never saw. Qanat, underground water channels carved through rock and earth, carrying water from mountain aquifers to the cities and fields of the plateau. The construction began with a mother well, a shaft sunk at the foot of a mountain, sometimes over 300 meters deep, until it hit the water table. From there, a gently sloping tunnel was dug by hand toward the settlement, sometimes stretching 70 or 80 kilometers. Vertical shafts every 20 to 30 meters provided ventilation and access for maintenance. The gradient had to be exact, too steep and the water would erode the tunnel, too flat and the flow would stop. This precision was achieved without modern instruments, by specialized diggers called muqannis, a craft passed from father to son across generations. Darius understood the value of this work. He issued a decree. Anyone who built a new qanat or restored an abandoned one would be exempt from taxes. Not just for themselves, for their descendants, for 5 generations. The result was an explosion of underground engineering. At their peak, over 37,000 qanats irrigated the Iranian plateau. The Gonabad Qanat, built roughly 2,700 years ago, still provides water to nearly 40,000 people today. Its main shaft drops over 360 meters, and its tunnel stretches 45 kilometers. But the qanats did more than irrigate fields. In cities like Yazd, tall structures called badgirs caught the breeze and funneled it down over the cool qanat water below. The effect was remarkable. Indoor temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees. No fuel, no moving parts, just physics and patience. The world's first air conditioning, built millennia before electricity. Roads could be blocked, palaces could burn, but the water kept flowing underground, invisible, patient, and older than any king. Some of these channels are 3,000 years old. Some are still working today. Every conqueror who entered Persia saw the palaces, the roads, the armies. Almost none of them noticed the water. The qanats were the empire's most durable achievement and the one least likely to be targeted because they were underground. There may be a lesson in that. The Apadana Hall at Persepolis is where we can see this system frozen in stone. Imagine a hall held up by 72 columns, each one rising 65 feet into the air, capable of holding an audience of 10,000. The air carries the scent of cedar. The ceiling beams were shipped from Lebanon, 1,000 miles to the west. Along the grand staircase, stone reliefs show delegations from every corner of the empire, Lydians carrying gold bracelets, Ethiopians with an okapi, Bactrians leading camels loaded with lapis lazuli, Babylonians with textiles, Indians with gold dust and a donkey. Each delegation is carved at the same height. No nation bows lower than another. Call it art if you want. It was propaganda. the most sophisticated political messaging system of the ancient world, carved in stone for every visitor to absorb. Among them stands a figure we will return to later, a cup-bearer. He holds a gold rhyton, a drinking vessel shaped like a winged griffin. His robe is immaculate. His posture is composed. He has served wine at the center of the world's most powerful court. He does not know that this hall, these columns, and the cedar above his head will burn in a single night. Now here is where the story folds back. We saw how Cyrus took Babylon without a fight, but what he did next was the real innovation. He issued a clay cylinder, now housed in the British Museum, that declared the exiled peoples would be returned to their homelands. The temples that Babylon's previous king had desecrated would be restored. Forced worship of foreign gods would end. Among those freed were the Jews who returned to Jerusalem with Persian funding to rebuild their temple. This is why Cyrus is one of the few non-Jewish figures remembered with reverence in the Bible. The United Nations has called the cylinder the first charter of human rights. Some historians push back on that label. They argue it was standard Mesopotamian royal propaganda, a new king legitimizing his rule by promising restoration. And they may be right. The cylinder was certainly political. But look closer. Whether Cyrus believed in human dignity or simply in efficient governance, the outcome was identical. Populations that would have rebelled under Assyrian rule accepted Persian authority. The system worked not because it was moral, but because it was smart. Morality and strategy, in this case, produced the same policy. Tolerance was cheaper than conquest. Darius understood this as an accounting principle. It costs less to let a province keep its temples than to garrison it against revolt. Every empire after Persia, Rome, the Mongols, the British, would eventually rediscover this equation. Most of them learned it the hard way. What does the royal road of 500 BCE have in common with Amazon's logistics network? More than either civilization would be comfortable admitting. Both systems are built on the same principle: centralized oversight of decentralized operations. The satrap was a regional manager. The royal road was a supply chain. The eyes and ears of the king, the imperial inspectors who traveled the empire unannounced, were real-time data auditors. Darius did not merely govern an empire. He ran a platform. The interface was stone and horse. The logic was identical to what runs on servers today. For 2 centuries, that system held. But every machine has a breaking point. The satrap system that made governance efficient also made betrayal possible. A satrap with too much power could, and occasionally did, declare independence. Darius himself had spent the first years of his reign crushing 19 rebellions across the empire. He carved the record of those victories into the cliff face at Behistun, 100 meters above the road, in 3 languages, so that every traveler would see what happened to those who broke the system. Even after Darius, the problem never fully went away. In the 4th century BCE, a wave of satrap revolts, the so-called Great Satraps' Revolt, shook Asia Minor. Governors who had been trusted with armies and treasuries turned that trust into weapons. The empire survived, but each revolt drained the treasury and weakened the center. The road that moved information also moved armies, including enemy armies if the frontier fell. And the tolerance that held 100 nations together depended on one thing: a strong center. The moment the center weakened, the system had no ideological glue to hold it. Persia did not ask its subjects to love it. It asked them to benefit from it. The arrangement worked beautifully, as long as the benefits kept flowing. But when the treasury shrank, when the satraps sensed weakness, when the military stopped innovating, the machine did not bend, it cracked. Then came the wound that would echo forward 150 years. Xerxes expanded the empire and invaded Greece. The campaign produced legendary battles, Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and several thousand allies held a narrow pass against an army of 200,000. Salamis, where the Persian navy was lured into a strait too narrow for maneuver and destroyed. But the wound that mattered was not military. When Xerxes took Athens, he burned the Acropolis. The Greeks never forgot. Artaxerxes maintained the system after Xerxes. The satraps governed. The roads carried messages. The treasury filled. But by the time Darius III sat on the throne in 336 BCE, the machine was showing cracks. Satraps had grown more independent. The treasury had been drained by decades of conflict with Greece. The military had stagnated. And from the west, a 20-year-old Macedonian king was assembling the most disciplined fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. Alexander did not defeat Persia because he was braver. He defeated it because the system's center had weakened, and a decentralized empire without a strong center is a machine waiting to be unplugged. The battles at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela were decisive, but they were symptoms. The real failure was structural. Empires do not fall because the enemy is strong. They fall because the center can no longer hold the periphery. Alexander was the spark. The kindling had been drying for decades. In 330 BCE, Alexander's army reached Persepolis. What happened next is one of the most debated events in ancient history. The sources agree on the broad facts. Alexander held a banquet. Wine flowed. At some point in the night, fire was set to the palace complex. The cedar ceilings, shipped from Lebanon, assembled over decades, caught instantly. The flames spread through the Apadana, the treasury, the throne hall. By morning, the administrative heart of the Persian Empire was ash. Was it deliberate revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier? Was it a strategic message to the Persian nobility, the old order is finished? Or was it a drunken accident that spiraled beyond control? The ancient sources disagree. Plutarch suggests the courtesan Thais urged it on. Arrian implies Alexander regretted it. The truth is probably all three: strategy, alcohol, and momentum combining into a decision that could not be undone once the first torch was lit. What we know for certain is what was lost. The cedar beams that had taken a generation to install burned in hours. The stone reliefs cracked in the heat. The treasury had held an estimated 120,000 talents of gold and silver, roughly $25 billion in modern terms. Alexander had already emptied it. But the administrative archives, the provincial records, the bureaucratic memory of 2 centuries of governance, these were consumed by the fire. The cupbearer we met in the Apadana, his world ended that night. The gold rhyton he once held with such composure melted in the heat or was looted by soldiers who did not know its ceremony. The 72 columns still stood at dawn, blackened but upright. The stone reliefs survived, barely. But the cedar ceiling that had carried the scent of Lebanon across the throne room was gone. The hall was now open to the sky. The stars that appeared above Persepolis that first morning were not beautiful. They were a verdict. Revenge is a system failure. Alexander burned the building, but the building was already a symbol, not a command center. The real Persian system, the satrap network, the road, the administrative logic, did not live in Persepolis. It lived in the minds of the bureaucrats and engineers who had run it for 2 centuries. Stone can burn, procedures cannot. The fire took Persepolis, but it did not take what Persepolis had built. This is the part of the story that is almost never told. Alexander did not dismantle the Persian system. He adopted it. He kept the satrapies. He married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, the king he had just destroyed. His generals married Persian noblewomen in a mass ceremony at Susa. He wore Persian robes. He demanded prostration, the Persian court ritual that his own generals despised. The man who burned the palace spent the rest of his short life trying to become the system he had destroyed. And after his death in 323 BCE, his successors, the Seleucids, governed their share of the former empire using the same template Darius had designed. The road was still there. The satrap offices were still staffed. The bureaucratic language had shifted, but the logic was unchanged. Tolerance as infrastructure. Decentralized governance under central oversight. Information moving at the speed of the fastest horse. The palace was ash, the operating system was still running, but the Persian intellectual legacy did not stop at administration. Remember the qanats we saw earlier, those invisible channels beneath the plateau. While Persepolis burned and empires rose and fell above them, the water kept flowing. 3,000 years, still running. The palace was ash. The roads were conquered. But the infrastructure beneath the surface never stopped. We measure civilizations by their monuments. We should measure them by their infrastructure. The Apadana took decades to build and burned in hours. The qanats took centuries to dig and have never stopped. Monuments serve kings. Infrastructure serves everyone. The road remembers what the palace forgets. But the qanat remembers what even the road forgets. Persia's core invention was not a palace. It was an answer to an impossible problem. How do you run 100 nations as one? That answer did not die with Persepolis. It went underground, like the qanats. It resurfaced in Seleucid administration. It echoed in Roman provincial governance. It whispered through the Sassanid revival. And 800 years after Alexander's fire, on the banks of the Tigris, in a city called Baghdad, Persian scholars would pick up that same problem again. This time, they would answer it not with roads and satraps, but with algebra, medicine, and the stars. Ask anyone what civilization looks like, and they will describe what rises above the ground. Columns, palaces, gates. But the Persian experiment proved something else. The parts that last are the parts we cannot see. The systems, the logic, the way things are organized. Alexander could burn the cedar, he could crack the stone, he could melt the gold, but he could not burn a method. How do you govern 100 nations? How do you move information faster than an army? How do you hold diversity together without crushing it? Those problems did not disappear when Persepolis burned. They are still here. Every algorithm solves a version of them. Every supply chain runs on the same logic. The road remembers what the palace forgets, and some roads never end. This is Strata. When we say Persia, what comes to your mind first? And did this story change it? Tell us in the comments. We'll see you in the next era.